Hello, everyone. Buenos dias, buenas tardes. Welcome. Apologies, I don't speak Russian, but we do have a group of languages here today. So this session was originally set up to be in Spanish with simultaneous interpretation. We now also have Russian interpretation. So we welcome all of you. And for those who are speaking English with us today, we just note that we will be speaking slower and attempting to speak very clearly so that our interpreters can interpret this session to both Russian and to Spanish. And with that, I'd like to thank our interpreters for being with us here today and helping disseminate this knowledge. I'd like to welcome everyone for joining us today for this session on TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, specifically today for the banking sector. And we are today going to focus, it's the first part of a two-part training. And in this first part, we will be focusing on governance and strategy, which are the first two pillars of four pillars that make up the TCFD. You will see these slides in the chat box. You can download them and follow along. With that, I'd like to get started already, and I'd like to pass to our partners at the IFC to open this session. So I'm going to introduce Mrs. Liliana Pozo, who is the Sustainable Finance Advisory Services Manager at IFC. Over to you, Liliana, to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Tiffany, and welcome all to the kickoff of the Executive Training Task Force of Climate-Related Disclosures, TCFD, from climate risk to opportunities. First, let me extend the warmest welcome to all participants and trainers joining us today. IFC is a member of the World Bank Group and is the world's largest development bank supporting the sustainable development of the private sector in emerging markets. We have a strong and growing focus on the climate agenda, and we support the achievement of all sustainable development goals. Currently, an average of 35% of our annual portfolio is allocated to climate change mitigation, adaptation, and other environmental projects carried out by commercial banks and companies. We support them with all types of financing and advisory services. The Climate Finance Advisory Team supports banks, microfinance institutions, funds, stock exchanges, regulators, and other key financial players in designing and implementing the transformation towards responsible and sustainable business models, which, without giving up the necessary commercial profitability, also seeks to generate a positive social and environmental impact with strong governance. The TCFD advisory program for banks has already delivered 3 cohorts of this executive training in 2023. We are seeing a strong demand for this climate training, given the acceleration of the climate finance transformational journey that the financial sector is undergoing, moving from traditional banking to sustainable and responsible banking. The impact of climate change is leading to substantial structural adjustments to the global economy, impacting the business and operations of the financial sector. The banking sector plays a fundamental role in emerging markets for implementing the climate agenda and directing the very much needed climate finance flows for financing the journey to net zero and to Paris alignment. Climate change is a major material systematic risk that can affect the stability of financial markets that need robust, comprehensive, and high-quality data on the impacts of climate change to allocate capital and take mitigation and adaptation actions. There is a growing demand for decision-useful, climate-related financial information by investors, which has led to a need for banks to update their knowledge of climate-related risks and reporting frameworks. In this context, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, has become one of the main tools to give banks and companies the roadmap on how to disclose material information investors need about climate risk and opportunities. The TCFD framework was launched in 2017, and as of today, over 3,800 companies worldwide use it voluntarily. Nearly 60% of the world's 100 largest public companies support the TCFD and/or report according to TCFD recommendations. I am thrilled about today's training for several reasons. First, it results from a powerful coalition of standard setters and leading organizations. GBAC, as the partner who brought this one-in-a-kind public offering to you today, we are proud to represent Latin America and Europe in a powerful coalition of standard setters that made this course possible today. Financed by IFC and in alliance with the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative, United Nations Environment Program Finance Initiative, and Climate Disclosures Project, we have joined forces to develop a learning program specifically targeted at financial institutions to enhance their sustainability and climate disclosure reporting capacity. You will hear from experts at the forefront of developing and implementing climate-related financial reporting. It builds on the climate disclosure training program of UNSSE, IFC, CDP, delivered with 40 stock exchanges in 55 markets to 15,000 companies. In a nutshell, IFC is thrilled to collaborate with UNSSE, UNEP-FI, and CDP in this very important course. We wish you a fruitful learning experience and exchange of ideas over the two TCFD training sessions and look forward to continuing to work with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Liliana, and thank you to our partners who have brought this training to everyone today. In addition to working with the IFC, we're also here with UNEP-FI as well as CDP, and together we will provide this training for you. I'm joined with a number of colleagues today to bring you expertise on this topic. So from the SSE, myself, the SSE Academy head, and Vanina Vijetsi, who's project officer of the SSE, will be presenting expertise from our line of work. We're also joined with experts on TCFD for banks from UNEP-FI, the UN Environment's Finance Initiative, and we're joined with Hina and Drew, and also with Raisa from CDP. So thanks everyone for joining us today. And if you have any questions throughout our training, all of us are here to answer your questions as they come to mind. Just a few housekeeping notes. For those of you who have already started, thank you for introducing yourself in the chat. Because it is a multilingual session today, we do have multiple languages also happening in the chat. Please feel free to use the language you're most comfortable with, and if we are capable of replying in that language, we will. I see that there are a few of you coming from English-speaking countries, so it looks like we'll probably have English, Russian, and Spanish being spoken in the chat. Welcome to all of you. If you do have a question, please ask that question in the Q&A box. You'll see either in the bottom or top of your Zoom screen that you can find a Q&A option. This allows us to keep track of your questions. If you ask your question in the chat box, it might get lost because there's so many people commenting today. So please be sure that you ask us your questions in the Q&A box today. And as one more point, I'll let you know that we will be sharing a feedback survey at the end of today's session, and that is how you will receive your CPD certified certificate. So please hang on to the end and please fill out that survey if you'd like to get your certificate. Great, so today's agenda. We have a lot to cover today, so I won't go into detail now, but just so everybody's aware, we'll start with an overview of what the TCFD is and how it's used to connect climate and finance. And then we'll look at how that feeds into the current climate reporting landscape. We'll do all of that in the first half or the first hour today. We'll give you a brief 5-minute break just to get up and do a stretch or grab yourself a coffee or tea. And in the second hour, we'll then dive into the first 2 pillars of the TCFD, which is governance and strategy. We'll also do a bit of a discussion into scenario analysis, which is a tool that can be used and is part of the strategy component. And we'll leave you with a number of resources before you leave today. We do have a number of learning objectives here today as well. First of all, we hope to help you understand the key elements of climate-related financial disclosures that are recommended by the TCFD, and of course, why it's relevant to the banking sector in particular. We're looking to help you identify today how climate can be integrated into governance and what role appropriate climate governance plays in your organization's resilience and the resilience of those organizations that you invest in. We also are looking to help you to understand how banks can strategically respond to climate-related risks and opportunities. And finally, help you to understand how to use a scenario analysis as a tool for climate resilience. Great. So with that, we'd just like to launch here a quick poll. We will be launching polls throughout the session, and it's one way that we can interact with all of you. So please answer the poll that should be appearing on your screen. And that's just to give us a sense of how comfortable you currently are. Now, for those of you who don't speak Spanish, please just look at the options on your screen, and they appear in the same order in the poll. So the first one is you're an expert at TCFD. The second option is that you're confident, but you're here for an update or to enhance your knowledge. The third option is that you have very limited knowledge. You might have just had an intro to the TCFD. And the final option is that you have little or no prior knowledge to the TCFD and climate-related financial disclosures. Now, we've got great participation now. Nearly 70 of you have filled in this poll. So I'm going to go ahead and share those results. Great. So it looks like the majority of you, more than 50% of you, have some knowledge of TCFD, which is fantastic. 30% of you have none whatsoever, which is completely okay. I just want to recognize if there's anything that you don't understand, maybe an acronym or any concept that you've not been familiarized with, that we've not explained thoroughly enough, please ask us a question in the Q&A and we'll make sure to clarify that for you. Great. And with that, let's dig straight into the content. So we're going to start here with an overview of the TCFD's recommended disclosures. And to do that, we want to put it in the current risk climate context. So increasingly, we are seeing evidence of climate-related risks feeding into our global and systemic understanding of risks more broadly. Well, we're going to spend quite a bit of time today talking about climate risks specifically. We want to highlight the interconnectivity with other risks. So on the quote on the left here, you see from investment banking, when millions of people took to the streets to demand action on climate change, many of them emphasize the significant and lasting impact that it will have on economic growth and prosperity. Now, that's really where the TCFD's basis came from. That concept, which this quote's quite old now, from Larry Fink, I believe that was from 2015, but understanding that climate now is having a significant impact on not only economic growth and prosperity, but also business growth and prosperity. And that links to the table on the right-hand side there, which comes from the World Economic Forum's top global risks by likelihood. They yearly put out this list, and as you can see, since 2019, climate risks have been the top 3 risks facing businesses. So this year, the latest report shows that the top 3 risks by likelihood are failure to mitigate climate risk, failure of climate risk adaptation, and natural disasters and extreme weather events. As we'll discuss today, those risks really correspond with what TCFD considers transition risks, and that mitigation and adaptation to that transition of the world changing around us, and physical risks, which are those natural disasters and extreme weather events. So the reason that investors are expressing the need for companies to provide more information on climate-related risk management is because our current financial system, as Mark Carney, the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance, pointed out some years ago now, it doesn't appropriately address the time horizons that we see with climate. And so, as you'll see with this quote from Mark Carney, the horizons for monetary policy extends out 2 to 3 years, and for financial stability, perhaps a little bit longer, but typically only to the outer boundaries of the credit cycle, about a decade. In other words, once climate change becomes a defining issue for financial stability, it may already be too late. And as we're discussing today, these climate-related risks and opportunities, what's important to keep in mind is that decisions we make today have a significant impact on our businesses in the future. So if we're going to mitigate or adapt to climate-related risks, we often have to make those decisions maybe 10 years before we actually see that impact, which is why we're having to change slightly how we report on our risk mitigation. So the good news is that the TCFD really provides a lot of guidance on how to understand what the financial impact of climate may be on your organization. Now, if we just start here with the financial impact of climate-related risks, TCFD provides categorization of risks that a number of organizations are now using themselves, and that we highly recommend all of you use. You can see on the left-hand side here that there is a list of risks, and these are categories of risks that the TCFD recommends all companies consider. So as I mentioned, there's transition risks, which have to do with the transition to a low-carbon economy, and those risks can be categorized as policy and legal risks, technology risks, market risks, and reputation risks. I might just highlight here, for example, when we're talking about market risks, what we want to understand here is that there's changes in the market that we have to be considering as we're moving forward. So, for example, as an organization, you might be investing in companies through different means, and you might see that the requirements in the markets and the demands in the markets are changing. That's often very linked to technology risks, which might be the development and use of emerging technologies such as renewable energy, battery storage, energy efficiency, etc. We'll also see market risks as an opportunity, which we'll discuss momentarily. But then looking at these transition risks, you can see that then they flow into financial impact. So when we talk about financial impact in the TCFD, what we really want to understand is how these particular risks that have been identified to come from climate can impact a company's financial performance and their financial portfolio. So when we say financial performance, what we're really talking about is how does it influence your revenues, your costs, your cash flow, your impairment charges, your losses, etc. All of this which you would see on your financial statements. Also, this can impact specifically for the banking sector, your financial position. So for all organizations, this can impact your carrying amount on assets. And for banks in particular, this might impact your portfolio value or your liabilities and your equity. For example, understanding how changes in policy, new regulation, for example, on emissions, might impact the value of the companies that you hold in your portfolio. So this is what the TCFD is doing, is helping understand how these risks, which may be transition or physical risks, then impact us financially. Now, just to highlight before we go on, when we talk about physical risks, these can be both acute and chronic. So acute risks are really those physical risks that are event-driven, such as increased severity in extreme weather events like cyclones, hurricanes, and floods. And chronic risks is things that are really building up over time, such as temperature rises and sea level rises. Great. So I did mention that market risks were also an opportunity, as many of the risks actually can be. So let's not forget about opportunities. We will talk a lot about risks today, but it's really important that all companies are keeping in mind that by not addressing these risks and opportunities, you actually can miss out on a lot of money in opportunities. So I share this slide here because the report that it comes from, which is a CDP report from 2019, analyzes 500 of the world's biggest companies by market capitalization, and 215 of them, which represent about $17 trillion in market capitalization, provided estimations of the potential financial impact of those climate-related risks and opportunities. So they identified through this report that there was approximately $970 billion at risk to climate. However, the same report also found that there was $2.1 trillion up for grabs in opportunities. So the opportunities actually far outweigh the risks. And as you see here, the financial services sector actually sees that even more enhanced. So what are these opportunities? Like risks, the TCFD provides a categorization of the opportunities that all organizations should be evaluating. So here you see those opportunities are resource efficiency, energy source related opportunities, products and services, markets, and of course, organizational resilience. Let's discuss, for example, market opportunities. And this involves proactively seeking opportunities in markets or types of assets that may be available to diversify activities and to better position a company for the transition to a low carbon economy. In particular, when we discuss market opportunities, we see that the opportunities exist to access new markets. For example, through collaborating with governments or development banks such as the IFC, or collaborating with small-scale entrepreneurs through, for example, impact investment and community groups in developed and developing countries as they're working towards the shift to a low carbon economy. For the banking sector, we're really seeing banks capitalize on this opportunity through underwriting or financing green bonds, for example, and other interest structures such as bonds or other products that help to position a bank to support a transition to low emission energy products. Also towards energy efficiency, grid connectivity, transportation networks, etc. So as with risks, what the TCFD is helping you do is to make that connection then to the financial impact. So by identifying these risks and opportunities, the TCFD has done the first step for you. Now, what you have to do is identify how those risks and opportunities could influence the financial statements and the financial portfolio of your organization. And same with risks, we want to see how that impacts your revenues, cost, cash flow, etc., as well as your portfolio value. Great. So with that, let's do another quick poll. Just launch this here. Great. Now, same with last time, the poll is in Spanish, but it corresponds exactly with your slide. So a quick quiz for all of you. What are examples here of financial impacts from climate a bank might report? First one being revenue growth from increased sustainable financing. The second being impact on talent acquisition due to the perception that your bank is not accurately addressing climate-related risks. The third being fines and judgments from new climate-related regulation. The fourth being increased competitive positioning as a result of changes in consumer preferences. And then, of course, all of the above. And I'll give you just a moment to fill that in. Okay, well, while you're filling it in, I'll just let you know that you're all doing very well. So the first one is revenue growth from increased sustainable financing. And revenue growth is indeed an opportunity from increased sustainable finance, which could be from accessing new markets like green bonds. The second option is impact on talent acquisition due to the perception that your bank is not accurately addressing climate-related issues. And indeed, not addressing climate-related issues poses a reputational risk, which is also a transition risk. And this can lead to a company struggling to attract the right talent, especially with the younger generations. The third one is fines and judgments from new climate-related regulation. And indeed, that also hits your balance sheet since you'll have to pay for those fines or the litigation. And this is a policy risk or a legal risk, which is one of the transition risks. And finally, the fourth one, consumer preferences. Again, this leads to an opportunity through markets. Additionally, this can also lead to resilience because this enhances your company's survivability as markets change. So actually, you were all correct, whichever one you answered there, but really it was all of the above. So I'm going to skip this slide because we're a bit short on time, but I highly recommend that you take a look at it on your own time. It helps break down the benefits from utilizing the TCFD's recommended disclosures in your own organization, both internally as well as externally as you interact with stakeholders. So let's look at the TCFD specifically and what it's used for and how it was developed. So the TCFD was developed to help identify the information needed by investors, lenders, and insurance underwriters to appropriately assess the financial impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities. So the key there is to really remember that TCFD is not necessarily about identifying how sustainable a company is or if it's a positive impact on the climate, but rather understanding how that company is addressing shifts in the climate and climate-related risks and opportunities so that they understand the financial impact of those risks and opportunities. The good news there is it was developed to actually shift or alter your existing reporting practices, not to create a new report. It also provides additional guidance for sectors that have slightly different requirements, such as the banking sector, as well as high-risk sectors. It discusses risks and opportunities in those categories we just discussed, and provides ample examples of what risks and opportunities you might want to be considering. And it introduces a lot more forward-looking processes. And to do that, it suggests using a scenario analysis tool, which we'll be discussing later today. Now, because the TCFD is so forward-looking, it also introduces setting disclosure in terms of short, medium, and long-term impacts, which your organization should identify those terms and number of years, how they best fit with your business cycle. And because we are looking in the future, we want both qualitative and quantitative disclosures. So we'll talk next time about metrics and targets where we go quite quantitative, but it's also important to discuss those qualitative aspects, such as in the governance component, where we want to understand how this is being governed. On the right-hand side of this slide, I'll just point out these are the 4 core pillars of the TCFD. They are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. We'll be discussing governance and strategy today, and tomorrow we'll discuss risk management and metrics and targets. But as you can see here, they're all very much interlinked and interconnected. So you should not see them as operating separately. It's important that you also recognize, as I mentioned before, that the TCFD was not developed to encourage additional reporting burden. Rather, it's developed to make our reporting practices more effective in order to allow investors to assess the financial impact that climate will have on organizations. So where should you report this information? Well, you should report it together with your financial statements. So in the same report that you provide investors on a quarterly or annually basis with your financial statements, together with that, you should be providing the context for those numbers. And this helps you integrate climate into that context together with your financial statements. Great. So as I mentioned, there are supplemental guidance for certain sectors that operate slightly differently, such as the banking sector. Just to make it quite clear, there's actually a pillar of usefulness of the guidelines. We start off with 4 core recommendations. So the 4 kind of pillars that support reporting. And in those 4 core pillars, which were the governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets, we then have 11 recommended disclosures. And all companies, all organizations should be disclosing on those 11 recommended disclosures, which we'll discuss today and tomorrow. However, then certain sectors, including the banking sector, have additional guidance. Now that's above and beyond those 11 recommended disclosures. And we'll show you an example of what that looks like. Here you can see from figure 5 of the TCFD's implementation guide, you can see how to determine what additional information certain sectors, such as a bank, should provide. So when we're talking about governance, all companies should provide the same information. And we'll momentarily go through that information. But when we move into the strategy component, banks, as you see, have a box under strategy A. And now strategy A, which we'll discuss more in detail later, but strategy A is identifying what are those risks and opportunities related to climate that can potentially have a financial impact on your organization. For banks, in addition to identifying those risks and opportunities, you should also consider characterizing their climate-related risks in context of traditional banking industry categories. So that's understanding how these risks integrate into credit risk, market risk, liquidity risk, and operational risk. So that's an example of an additional guideline for the banking sector. As we go through these 11 recommended disclosures and these 4 core pillars, we will flag where banks should be providing additional information. So I think it's important to also understand where your peers are. We don't have time to go through exactly how banks are all doing today because we've slowed down a little bit for the interpretation. However, you have these slides available to you, and I do recommend that you take a look at these next couple slides in your handout to understand how your peers are doing and to learn from them. The good news is actually the banking sector has really increased its TCFD disclosure as of late and is doing well on most all categories now. So you have a lot of peers to learn from as you progress in this process. I'll also highlight this report, which is in your handout, and really bring to light here the importance of taking action quickly. So this report, which is from Bain and Company, it looks at the top 15 banks by assets in 3 regions in Europe, Asia, Pacific, and North America. And it looks at them specifically for having pledged to reach net zero financed emissions by 2050. And in this report, they identify through an analysis of trajectories how different strategies might play out in terms of a bank's profit in the future. So for those companies that in 2021 they looked at, there was some that were considered pioneers, so the first movers to start to integrate climate into their portfolio decisions and their strategy. There were those that were seen to act a little bit later than the pioneers, the followers. And then there were the laggards that really took some time to get moving on this. And based on that trajectory that they've seen from 2021, they've actually estimated that by 2050, the pioneers will have increased their profit growth by about 25 to 30% compared to the others, the followers by about 5 to 10%, and the laggards will actually have a 10 to 20% lower profit than the pioneers. So it's important to take note here of how moving fast is really important, and that will be a great report you can use as you're building expertise within your own organization. And you can access that in the handout that's being shared. So as you do get started, it's important to start to make a roadmap. I won't focus too much on this slide because I think the next one can provide a little bit more detail to you. But just to note that every organization's roadmap will be slightly different. There's certain things we do recommend starting with. So first, we really recommend starting with an internal working group or a TCFD team. Climate really is a whole of organization issue. So you should be ensuring that throughout your organization, you have participants that understand the climate-related risks and opportunities facing their division, team, or geographical region. Then with that team, we suggest conducting a gap analysis. You can use the TCFD checklist, which is in the SSE model guidance on climate disclosure. That's on the SSE's website. It's also on the TCFD Knowledge Hub, and we'll drop it in the chat as well. In that Annex 1, the TCFD checklist can help you to identify what might be missing from your disclosure already. Once you identify the gaps, you can start then laying out the next stages of your roadmap. And on this slide, this is a helpful tool from TPI that you can use as you start to develop your roadmap. The first level from level 0 to level 1 is simply acknowledging in your reporting that you are taking action on climate. Often we see that as the development of a policy internally and having the CEO or the board chair writing in your financial report a statement of how you plan to move forward. Then you'll move through a level of capacity building and then into integrating this into your business decisions and business operations, and then finally integrating it into your strategic decision making. So I'm going to skip this because we're short on time, and I'm going to pass the word over to Raisa, who's going to discuss with you how this fits in now into our climate reporting landscape. Over to you, Raisa.
Hello, Tiffany. I hope you all are hearing me well. Hello, everyone. It's nice to be here. I'm Raisa Sare. I'm Policy Coordinator at CDP Latin America. And today we're going to talk a little bit about how the disclosure landscape has evolved in recent years. Please let me know if I start speaking too fast for the interpreters. So let me try to, yeah, it's working. So Tiffany has already established that climate change is a really important issue for financial organizations. They have to consider that and think through. But we are also seeing that this is accelerating into big changes in policy regulations and standards. While TCFD remains a voluntary market-led initiative, we are seeing many governments and regulators taking steps to require or encourage disclosures based on the TCFD recommendations. Over 120 regulators and governments all around the world are TCFD reporters. So we're talking about Belgium, Japan, New Zealand, and the UK, just to mention a few. However, regulatory authorities are doing much more than just supporting the TCFD through words. Many countries, such as the UK, the US, or Japan, have already taken steps to mandating climate disclosure or proposing disclosure in line with the TCFD. In this slide, we can quite clearly see that there's a real regulatory and policy movement behind the TCFD. This image is a little bit old, but you can find a more updated version in the TCFD report that was launched in 2022. So when we zoom in from general regulatory movements to requirements specific for the banking sector, we should consider what brings as relevant in the TCFD's guidance for banks. One of the supplemental guidance that Tiffany just mentioned in her presentation. A bank should look to provide metrics used to assess the impact of transition and financial and physical climate-related risks on their lending and other financial intermediary business activities, considering both the short, medium, and long terms. The metrics provided may relate to either credit exposure, equity, debt holdings, or trading positions. As I mentioned, we are seeing mandates for TCFD in many different jurisdictions, some particularly noticeable ones. First, that I wanted to mention is in the US, we see the SEC requirements for disclosure. In the EU, we have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which goes a little bit beyond the TCFD, looking at other areas as well, but also very much aligned to the core pillars that Tiffany has mentioned in her presentation. And then another key area as well that I'll get to in a sec is the ISB Standards, which we had some news last week, if I'm not mistaken, with two standards that were launched. We are also seeing central banks starting to go through stress testing exercises, such as the Bank of England, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, Bank of Canada, and this could increasingly start influencing supervisory and regulatory action in this space. So when we talk about this whole regulatory movement, the aspect of international standardization, which has already received a big push due to the work of the IFRS Foundation. And in November 2021, the IFRS Foundation announced the creation of its new International Sustainability Standards Board, which we typically know as ISSB. The ISSB has its main task developing a comprehensive global baseline of high-quality disclosure standards to meet investors' information needs. The ISSB was launched at COP26 in Glasgow. And as you can see in this slide, we have a picture from that announcement. It was welcomed by many world leaders. The structure of the ISSB disclosure requirements is very much aligned with the TCFD, as we're going to discuss in a second. Pass this. Okay, it's working. And in this slide, what I like to highlight are these aspects of the TCFD and ISB alignment. In the first instance, just to remind everyone that the ISSB standards stipulate general requirements as well as requirements related to specific themes and industries as well. The first theme that we see is climate coming from the ISSB, although we are going to see other sustainability themes coming as well. What we also think is important to highlight when we're talking about this is that based on what has already been released so far from ISSB, it has remained consistent with the four core pillars or focus areas of the TCFD, being the structure that Tiffany mentioned a couple slides ago. Just as a reminder and to reinforce what has already been said, the pillars are governance and strategy that we're discussing today, and risk management and metrics and targets that tomorrow we're gonna go into a little bit further in the second part of the training. And the specific 11 disclosure recommendations within each of those areas for climate. The only areas where TCFD and ISSB climate standards differ is in the level of granularity or additional or different language used. But when we look at the big picture, largely these are very much aligned. Skip one. Okay. And the reporting scenario, as you can see, and we showed a little bit, is a constantly evolving space. And one of the key topics that we often get asked about is how do we consider nature and biodiversity relating to climate? And now we enter in another relevant topic, international reporting discussion. So here we are going to see how the TNFD and TCFD align. We recently saw the launch of the final version of the TNFD guidelines. And to explain a little bit more, what is the TNFD for those who are not familiar, is the task force on nature-related financial disclosures. The main mission of the TNFD is to develop and deliver a risk management and disclosure framework for organizations to report and act on evolving nature-related risks. The ultimate aim of supporting is supporting a shift in global financial flows away from nature negative outcomes and towards nature positive outcomes. Thinking about how the TNFD connects to the TCFD, TNFD framework is anchored by the same 4 pillars that we showed of the TCFD approach, and all of the 11 recommended disclosures have also been incorporated into the TNFD final draft. This provides market participants with a high level of alignment with the structure, language, and approach already taken by the TCFD. This should also encourage and enable market participants to move towards integrated climate nature disclosures. Like the TCFD, the TNFD is also a global framework for risk management and disclosure, but it's important to highlight that's not a standard. The final draft draws from and also is designed to inform relevant standards, including those from the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB that I mentioned, and the Global Report Initiative, known also as GRI, both that are knowledge partners of the TNFD. And here I'm not going to go into specifics in this slide, but feel free to explore a little bit more. You're going to receive this material. And it's important for banks to explore a little bit more in this information and consider the TCFD as a starting point. Once you build your capacity and enhance the policies and processes already underway in your organization, you can then expand to nature, to social issues as well, understanding that the whole ESG spectrum is interconnected. And because of time, I'm not gonna go into specifics in this slide, but basically what it has as main information here is how all of these frameworks fit together. So this image here is a useful concept that was developed by the IFRS Foundation, which looks at the different frameworks in a building blocks approach. So considering first the financial reporting in the center or in the bottom of the slide, as you can see, as a first foundation, first block of information. This is what most companies already report on. And then you build on top of that information. But you're going to receive this material so you can explore a little further. And now I get to a little question. The ISSB standards are only relevant for organizations using IFRS. So it's going to appear in your screen in a couple of seconds. I think it's not this one, TCFD for banks. Okay, now it's correct. Thank you. So it's appearing in Spanish in your screen, but it's exactly the same as this slide. So the ISSB standards are only relevant for organizations using IFRS, true or false? So let's
Here I mentioned about a question. Should I fazer o programa? O lembro da sabe e o mais deve ter aprovado.
I think a couple more seconds for us to have the answers.
Pega esse meio caminho.
Okay, most of you got it right. It's the ISSB standards are not important just for organizations using IFRS. Why is that? Most of the other global standards and frameworks are related to ISSB in one way or another. I would like to highlight 3 types of relations that they have with ISSB. First, either they are being formally consolidated with ISSB and will no longer exist independently. So we are talking about CDSB, for example. So any companies that are reporting into these programs will just report into ISSB. Second one is that the other global frameworks or standards are collaborating with ISSB to align some climate-related disclosures. This includes both GRI and CDP, and along with most national regulators programs. Or the third is that they are remaining as a foundation of ISSB, where ISSB covers similar disclosures while taking a step further. So this mainly applies to the TCFD. So as we saw, it's a base that where ISSB builds upon. So furthermore, the idea of the ISSB can encourage the integration of sustainability into investment processes. Providing standardized and comparable information can help promote investments that integrate ESG factors. The ISSB can support development of finance products such as green bonds, increasing confidence in more sustainable finance products. And with this one, I finalize my presentation. We are going to have a short break, and then we are going to come back in 5 minutes. Thank you all.
Well, esteemed hosts and co-hosts, this is the interpreter Natalia Zayed speaking. I had a problem with the connection. I've been kicked out of Zoom. Please appoint me an interpreter again. Can you hear me?
Yes, I will.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry. It's, connectivity problem, but thank you.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hina Majid and I'm from the UNEP FI. And I'm delighted to be here today. And I'm going to be speaking to all of you about governing climate risks and climate opportunities. Now, the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of information about what the TCFD says around disclosing governance. I'm going to talk you through a couple of real-life examples of disclosures around climate governance that firms have made. And then I'm going to set you or direct you to some further information and resources that you can use to help you develop sound and robust disclosures. So what you have in front of you is TCFD's 4-pillar regime. And this is something that should be pretty familiar to you now, having seen it a couple of times during this session. And TCFD asks you as firms to disclose your governance around your climate risks, but also your climate opportunities. Now, when we talk about governance, what we're effectively talking about are two key questions. The first question is, how do your bank boards oversee climate-related issues? And the second question is, how does your management both assess and manage your climate-related risks and opportunities? So two core questions to think about. Now, the slide in front of you is a governance disclosure checklist, and it's built upon the TCFD's expectations, and it draws upon our two key questions about the board's oversight of climate risks and opportunities and management's role, which appear in box A and box B. So what I'm going to do now is just talk you through some of these expectations that TCFD has and tell you a little bit about how firms are addressing them in practice. So starting with the board, TCFD wants you to disclose the role of your board, its expertise, and the board committees that you have overseeing your risks and opportunities. So what this means in practice is it wants you to identify if you have particular directors on your board who have responsibility for this area, or if you as a firm have chosen to delegate the responsibility of the board to board level committees. And in practice, we see a range of committees at the board level covering this area. So they could be risk committees, they could be ESG committees, they could be audit committees, or they could be some combination of these options. I also mentioned the board's expertise. So here TCFD wants you to disclose information about your director's experience in this area or relevant experience in this area. It wants you to tell them about directors' qualifications in this area. And it wants you to tell them about the training that you as firms are providing to your directors. Now, you see the third point here is about board oversight and responsibilities. And here, what the TCFD wants you to elaborate upon is, how is your board informed about climate risks and opportunities? And with what frequency does this take place? Now, again, thinking about how firms approach this, some firms have recurring agenda items for their boards or their committees. other firms have developed board-level dashboards with relevant climate metrics that they produce with some regularity to their boards and their committees. And other firms use some combination of these measures or other options altogether. The other thing that board oversight and responsibility entails is it wants to know whether your board takes into consideration these climate-related issues when it's, for example, setting strategy, when it's setting risk management, when it's undertaking financial planning or budgeting. So boards should consider this both in the setting of these and also in the reviewing of these, and you should articulate how they do this and the extent to which they do this. Our fourth point here is around board evaluation and performance. So how is your board assessed when it comes to dealing with climate-related risks and opportunities? Do you, for example, use climate metrics to do this? So some banks, for example, have or use scorecards to assess directors, and they tie them to certain climate metrics. So it could be the level of climate financing or tied to other emissions targets. And some banks also link that to their remuneration structure. So this could be your variable remuneration. And if that happens, TCFD would want you to disclose the weighting given to climate in your remuneration structure. So that's just a brief overview of what TCFD is looking for when it comes to the board. When it comes to management in box B, what we're talking about here really are senior management levels that are below the level of the board. And here, TCFD asks you to set out responsibilities given to management and management functions and committees. And what you should be careful to disclose here is both their role and the committee's role in both assessing and managing these risks. It also asks for associated organizational structures. So what we're interested in here is, does your management have a reporting line up to your board? And how does that take place? And similarly, how is management informed about climate risks and opportunities? How does it monitor this area? So do you have reporting up to your management from the business, for example? Now, what you have here is quite an interesting extract from TCFD's 2022 report, sorry. And what it shows is that governance is one of the least disclosed areas in relation to firms' disclosures. And that's pretty interesting if we contrast that with the Eurozone, for example. So the ECB regulates certain banks in the Eurozone, and there we see actually that for banks, disclosures in relation to governance are pretty extensive, and we see challenges elsewhere, for example, in the case of strategy. So lots of reasons for that, but we don't have time today to think about that in detail. Now, what I want to do here is just talk you through a few good practice examples. Now, these good practice examples are not perfect, but they do have a number of features that you can think about and reflect upon when you develop your own disclosures. So the first example comes from a financial services firm called Schroders. And what I like about this diagram here is that it shows very clearly both what the board does in relation to climate risks and opportunities, and what the management does in relation to this area. And this is made clear by the circles, the colors, also the keys, so these little lines linking each of these areas. And it's also really clear from this diagram who reports into who. And a final point to just flag here is that in terms of these communication channels between the board and committees, we think it's helpful that these are formalized through working groups and committees. This is also from the same disclosure here, but what I like about this is it's providing a description of the two committees, so a board committee and a management committee. There's information about the number of meetings that have taken place, a description of these committees and what they do and their scope, and importantly, what they've been doing in 2022 on both climate and nature. There's another example here, which I won't spend too long on, and it comes from Nedbank. But again, you see a very clear overview of how climate is covered both by the board and management. And you see here, there is a climate task team. So this is the column on the left-hand side of the screen. And you see very clear reporting lines from that team right up to the board. So the information flow is very, very clear. Our third example comes from the Standard Bank Group. Now, again, you see in the boxes in the middle of the screen that Standard Bank provides a description of the roles of its board committees when it comes to climate. And it's specified the decisions or some of the key decisions that have been taken. And the other nice thing about this is it talks about what it's going to do in the future if you look at the box on remuneration. Two other features that I really like on this is, firstly, we talked about board expertise. And here you see in the left-hand side of the slide that this bank talks about the actual training that they have given their board directors. And they specify who this was with. We also see on the right-hand side of the slide that there's an explanation of how the board's oversight takes place in practice and what the board are made aware of. So really nice overview in this slide. Now, I want to finish off this part of the session by just flagging some useful resources that you can draw upon to develop good and robust disclosures around governance. And so you see on this slide in front of you, there are various materials from the TCFD. I would in particular recommend the final recommendations and recommended disclosures and the implementation guidance. We'll talk a little bit about governance tomorrow when it comes to transition plans, linking to the TCFD publication on this. The other thing that I think is really useful is that around the world, global regulators have been looking at this in jurisdictions where TCFD has been embedded. So I would highly recommend, for example, that as banks, you also look at the reports that have come out from the ECB examining climate disclosures, because they have lots of practical examples about both good practice and bad practice in this area. Want to just mention a final point, which is that UNEP-FI has a climate program, and we also offer regional capacity building. So you can have a look at this slide, which details our offering in your own time. And if you're interested, you can contact the colleagues listed on the slides. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Tiffany.
Thank you, Hina, for that great explanation, and really to emphasize the expertise from the UNEP-FI's team on banking in particular. So if you do have any questions, ask them now during the session, or contact them for additional training and education in your market. I just want to flag one other resource. I'm going to move a bit forward here. Great. With the IFC, they are now launching more tools every day. So I recommend checking the IFC website, ifc.org/climate governance. This is also in your handout. And based on the IFC's really well-established corporate governance methodology, this tool provides really practical and progressive climate-related actions from basic practices, level 1, to leadership, which they classify as level 4, for each of the 6 parameters of corporate governance methodologies that you see on your screen now. So a few extra tools in the governance sphere as you move forward. And with that, I'd like to pass to our other colleague at UNEP-FI, Drew, to discuss climate resilience strategy, the second pillar of the TCFD. Over to you, Drew.
Great. Thank you, Tiffany. I'm happy to be here today to speak about the strategy pillar of the TCFD recommendations. And I'm also a member of the climate risk and TCFD team with Hina at UNEP-FI. And so happy to jump right into it. So to go into the next inner ring of this 4-pillar structure, we have the strategy structure and strategy recommendation. So strategy disclosures are important for showing the firm's understanding of its climate-related risks and exposures in the area of core business, strategy, and financial planning. So it fits in as part of its operational resilience strategy in the face of climate change, its planning, and also its overall decision-making. So the strategy pillar can provide insights to the type, the magnitude, as well as the different time horizons of climate-related exposures across all of your different business lines. So this includes potential impacts of climate risk, along with climate-related opportunities that Tiffany was mentioning earlier. These are the ones that can arise through low-carbon technologies, investments, and also products and services that your business is now offering as an opportunity in the transition. So it's also important to note that strategy disclosures focus on the need to address how an institution can integrate these risks and opportunities that they have identified into the overall business strategy and financial planning. So to move on, we also have the strategy checklist for the 3 different areas of the strategy pillar. We have the financially material risks and opportunities, financial impact, and then we have resilience. And so the first recommended disclosure focuses on identifying climate risks and opportunities through a materiality assessment, focused on identifying the key risks and opportunities across different time horizons, different geographies, and different business units. The second main component is financial impacts. So determining the impacts of these risks and opportunities on the institution's business strategy, its financial planning, as well as the institution's business as usual. So finally, we have the resilience aspect of the disclosure. That would be focusing on the resilience of the organizational strategy and the use of scenario analysis to identify such resilience under different climate scenarios. So some good practices for these components include disclosing the details of the time horizon that is used, providing a justification for each of the different time horizons that you pick. It's important to really provide that justification for selecting a certain time horizon or another, and then to link that time horizon with your climate risk that you have identified. So then it's also important to explain the methodologies and processes that are used to identify these climate risks and opportunities that you are disclosing. This includes providing descriptions of the risks and opportunities that are identified, as well as their impacts on your different business lines, and providing a description of why these different financial metrics and underlying methodologies were used to identify, measure, and prioritize these risks along with their impacts. So it's also important that organizations disclose how they plan to manage these impacts, as well as linking all of these climate impacts to their financial planning. And scenario analysis in particular is especially important in this aspect of strategy disclosures. That's something we'll be going further into detail after this. But one other thing I'll note, if you see at the top there, you have the different considerations for banks. So the TCFD mentioned before provides additional guidelines for banks. And in this situation, under the strategy pillar, they recommend that banks provide information on credit exposure risk and the activities in their lending and intermediary business risks. So moving on briefly, just to go over the different progress across these different disclosure elements. We have the progress you can see at the top that recommended disclosures and risks and opportunities are much ahead of the others. And that's an important thing to consider going forward, how to improve, for example, the resilience of strategy at the bottom there, because it's lagging in terms of uptake and percentage change recommended disclosures over time. So this is something, and that includes scenario analysis. So I think overcoming the challenges of scenario analysis and being able to implement these effectively are an important consideration. So just getting into some concrete examples of what the strategy pillar looks like in practice. The first is sourced from Barclays TCFD report in 2021, and you can find the link there if you want to look through it. So the report highlights the climate-related risks and opportunities, like I mentioned before, over the different time frames and time horizons. You can see in the top right, you have the short term, which is the 0 to 1 year time period, the medium term, which is 1 to 5 years, and then the long term, which is 5 to 30 years. So also, this report outlines the institution's support for strategies across a diverse range of clients. So you have different clients you're engaging with, including emerging companies, large corporations, and also governments. So while we will be going through the risks and opportunities that the TCFD specifically highlights in part 2 of the webinar, I'll just now highlight that the disclosures use the same terminology as the TCFD to classify the risks. It further identifies then what the impact it expects to see from each of these identified risks. So for example, when you're looking at physical risks, the bank highlights the acute physical risk, such as hurricanes, floods, and wildfires, and how they impact your credit and market risks, as well as posing a risk to your business continuity as your organization assesses this. So you can see in those first couple bullet points at the table, at the top, what I'm talking about there. So like you said, you can go back and look at these examples later on and go through them in detail in those links. So another example we have is the strategy pillar from RBC. So RBC made use of scenario analysis to identify these key physical and transition risks. So it's important that they were identifying the key financial vulnerabilities that their portfolios are exposed to. So you can see that they use this information to adjust their future strategies and their priorities to become more resilient to climate change. And one key example for banks in particular are the fact that banks hold a lot of real estate and mortgage portfolios. So physical risks have a large impact on these portfolios. So looking at the acute hurricane events, flooding, wildfires, like I mentioned before, but also the chronic events such as sea level rise. So you have that compounding effect across the different time horizons and different scenarios of climate change warming. So based on these learnings from the scenarios, RBC plans to improve its processes of robust analysis through more detailed assessments and risk identification, such as identifying impacts to cash flow, as well as changes in property prices, for example. So these exercises, these scenario analysis exercises are imperfect and they're constantly improving over time. And they're not meant to be a perfect forecast of what's likely going to happen, but it's important that firms identify these high-risk assets to make more informed strategic planning in the future. So just to go a bit deeper into the scenario analysis aspect, we have the use cases for climate scenario analysis. And as you can see, the TCFD and the climate-related disclosures are not just the only thing that you can use scenario analysis for. There are a lot of different range of use cases for scenario analysis. So it's important to recognize these and integrate these. So, scenarios, climate scenarios and scenario analysis are important for the strategy pillar, like I mentioned, but also for different areas such as risk management, climate stress testing, as well as business underwriting. So you can see here that, banks are starting to use climate scenarios to integrate climate into their underwriting processes. But also you can see on the right-hand side that institutions are using these for net zero target setting and also internal reporting. So these same scenarios can be used for a wide range of use cases, and they can be used in the end as meeting regulatory disclosure requirements, but they have a wide range of uses to be used. So just to get into what these scenarios are created from through these models, we have climate scenarios created by what is called integrated assessment models, so IAMs. And so this provides a high-level overview of what these scenarios are and how they're produced, the different inputs and the different contexts and the outputs that are used for the financial institutions. So these were initially developed for policymakers to determine the relationship between economic activities, greenhouse gas emissions, and climate change more broadly. So these different pathways produced by the IAMs project changes in different areas such as energy production demand, technological changes, changes in consumer behavior and consumption patterns, and climate policy implementation. And they typically provide complex details about energy systems, but they also make simplified assumptions related to climate systems and land use. So what they show and what they primarily focus on is showing the combination and timing of different greenhouse gas emissions mitigation scenarios to reach a specific warming target. So 1.5, 2.0, but it goes into the higher ranges to explore the potential impacts. So these are valuable when you're trying to analyze the trade-offs between different mitigation pathways. And you have relevant factors in the form of technology and land use developments, investments, carbon prices, tech deployment, as you can see on the right. So just an example of one of the more popular used scenarios, so that would be the NGFS, so the Network for Greening the Financial System. So this was created by a group of central banks who released these different reference scenarios to be used for the financial sector in particular. So this slide actually doesn't include the most recent phase 3 of their most recent scenarios, but we'll just be going into the different areas and key narratives that the NGFS covers in their different scenarios. So based on the different levels of transition and physical risks. And you can see here in this box, the 4 different areas. So you have the orderly scenarios, the disorderly scenarios, the hothouse world, and too little too late. So these orderly scenarios, they assume that climate policies are introduced very early on and they become gradually strengthened on a global scale, and relatively both physical and transition risks are relatively subdued and low. And in the disorderly scenarios, you have higher transition risks due to delayed policymaking and ones that also diverge across countries and sectors. And in this situation, carbon prices are typically higher for a given temperature outcome. And so the next one, you have the hothouse world scenarios, and they assume that climate policies are implemented somewhat on a different scale, different jurisdictions at different speeds, but they're insufficient to significantly halt global warming. And these critical thresholds of temperatures are exceeded, so they lead to very severe physical risks and irreversible impacts such as sea level rise. And the last area would be the too little too late scenarios. So while no scenarios currently have been designed for this purpose, this can be explored to determine the higher physical risk outcomes for your disorderly situation, your disorderly scenarios. And NGFS are just one of the most popular. There are others that financial firms have been using, such as the IPCC, representative concentration pathways, the RCPs, the International Energy Agency, the IEA, as well as the inevitable policy response IPR scenarios. So how institutions decide which scenarios to use depends on the institution's needs. And to do this, institutions, they want to first look at what is their climate target or the warming target that they want to look at. You want to understand also the sector and the regional, the level of granularity you want to participate in this scenario, and just look at under which scenario, what meets your requirements the best. And so the next step would be to understand the different assumptions of these scenarios developed by the modelers. So one example being when you're looking at carbon dioxide or renewable energy, just understanding that each sector has a different dynamic, and then you understand which better suits your institution's needs. And in this sense, scenario analysis is a progressive journey. So over time, it can be a learning experience. And over time, you get more and more capabilities as you go and you have more experience implementing these. And so quickly, we have the additional resources the TCFD has for strategy disclosures. And you have the recommendations by the TCFD in terms of implementation and guidance on scenario analysis on a sector basis. But it also has implementation guidance specifically for banks in particular. So I definitely recommend checking out these resources and looking through and seeing how they can help your organization. And so now we have come to another question for the group. And so does your bank currently conduct scenario analysis? This is just to see more or less like what level the participants are at. Are they familiar with these? Are they doing it just for transition risk? Are they doing it for physical risks, or both? Or do you have plans in the future, but you're not currently implementing scenario analysis, but you want to going forward? So I'll give it some time to get the results on this. And actually, I cannot see the participants, the the votes coming in, so I'm not sure who would be sharing that, Tiffany. But
Hey,
yeah.
sorry, you can't see them. I'll give everyone then maybe 5 more seconds.
Yeah.
And we'll share it and you should see it then.
Great, perfect.
No problem.
So yeah, we'll give a few more seconds for the results. And so we can see that a lot haven't currently implemented scenario analysis, but they plan on in the future, or they haven't at all yet. But we have a significant, about 20% who have actually implemented these scenario analysis for both, which is encouraging. So that's great. And then, so I do think we have a little bit of time to go through just briefly these different scenarios. And like I mentioned before, this was covered in my previous slide, but to go forward and to do a homework that I will show to you in a few minutes, that you can go through all these slides for your organization to explore the different scenarios and decide how you want to use the NGFS scenario exercise and just get an introduction. And you can see in the chat that we have the resources from the NGFS so that participants can make use of this. And so just to give a better overview of the breakdowns of the different scenario analysis, we have the orderly, disorderly, hothouse world. So within these categories, you have the different specific scenarios in terms of warming targets. And you have the net zero, which is the ideal, the 1.5. And then you have the below 2 degrees. So those are both a part of the orderly. And then you have the disorderly, and you have divergent net zero, which is reaching net zero, but at a significantly higher cost due to divergent policies and across sectors. And then you have the delayed transition, which is similar, and it assumes that these emissions are not actually decreasing until 2030, and the use of carbon dioxide removal is limited. And finally, at the bottom, you have the hothouse world scenarios where you have the nationally determined contributions that are the current status of policy implementation and commitments, but they lead to a higher emission scenario and higher warming scenario, as you can see in these charts. And you also have specific, pictures of how this evolves in the future up to 2050, carbon price development, along with the CO2 emissions by the different scenarios. And lastly, you have the current policies, assuming that business as usual is occurring and leading to runaway warming. And you can see here also a heat map type approach of color coding to show how more or less which category has a breakdown under physical risk and also transition risk. So the different policy reactions, the different technology changes, CO2 removal, and regional variations in policies, as well as the ambitions to achieve these warming scenarios across the different categories. And so the homework that we would like our participants to take part in, we want to give you a chance to take the time to think about how these scenarios might be useful in your own risk management processes. So it would be great if you could take a moment today to read through the scenarios again that we just discussed and to think about the questions on this slide in particular. Think about how you understand these scenarios and how they can be applied within your organization. So if you have any questions that arise from this and these questions, please feel free to reach out and ask us in the second part of the training. So yeah, it would be great. And I think it would be valuable for all of your institutions to think about these questions if you haven't been already, especially based on the feedback we got that this is still a new subject for a lot of people. So this would be great. And with that, I will be finished talking about the strategy pillar and scenario analysis. And I will also now hand over to Tiffany to go through the final section on resources. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Drew. And thanks to everybody who's been asking a number of questions in the Q&A. We might have time actually to discuss one or two of those. So when we get through our resources, I would be happy to discuss a few of those questions with those of you who have time for that. But before we do conclude this training today, as both Drew and Hina have just mentioned, and then also earlier, Raisa, we have a number of tools available to you. We've been sharing a few of them in the Q&A as well, but just to highlight where you might want to get started as you begin to advance your journey on this topic. Now, first and foremost, while we're summarizing the recommendations of the TCFD today, please do make use of the recommendations themselves and the final report, which has been translated to Spanish. So those Spanish speakers here today, you can also read the recommendations of the TCFD in your local language. Please do open up that report and have a look. I've been sharing a link to that report with many of you, because actually it's not just discussing these 11 recommended disclosures, it's also providing you different tools, for example, of how to analyze risk. A few of the questions we've been seeing in the Q&A have been exactly that. How do we determine what risks and what opportunities we want to put in our report? And the easy answer is those which have a financial impact. So the TCFD does talk you through how to do this, and I recommend making use of that guide. You can also use the SSE's model guidance on climate disclosure for a summary of how to get started. And in particular, I recommend using Annex 1 of the model guidance, which is a TCFD checklist. This checklist lists every single disclosure that you should be considering including in your reporting practices. And you can already go ahead and check where those gaps are and then how to move forward. Now, another really great resource is the TCFD Hub. I've shared that also with a number of you, and that hub has additional online training. So if you wanted to learn more about governance or strategy, which we've discussed today, you can already go to the hub and do the governance and the strategy online training to be able to really set that in your knowledge gaps. I've also mentioned to make use of the IFC's many resources, and I do want to highlight the great resources that they have, particularly on governance. So the IFC launched their Beyond the Balance Sheet Disclosure and Transparency Toolkit and program to help companies in emerging markets go beyond traditional financial reporting, and to also report on material information regarding the corporate strategy, governance, risk management, and performance. And the toolkit pulls from dozens of different frameworks to distill best practices and offer a progressive way of how to do that. So we recommend checking out their resources at the IFC's website. Now, I'm also going to just briefly mention here a few tools on scenario analysis. There is a technical supplement from TCFD on a scenario analysis, so you can make use of that. All of these publications from TCFD are on the FSB-TCFD site or on that TCFD Knowledge Hub. You also would want to make use of the learning through the TCFD Hub and the NGFS Scenarios portal, which Drew mentioned. The NGFS scenario talked us through what that is. So please check out their website and start to play around with their scenarios. And we also have, of course, the resources on banks. And I might pass to Drew to go over specifically on, I think this, oh, sorry, I'm going to pass through these so that Drew can discuss the climate risk landscape report and how that can help you all in your journey as well.
Right, yeah, thank you. So this is part of one of our working groups. And so this climate risk landscape report, you may not have seen it. It came out in March this year. And basically what this was a result of was our climate risk tool working group. And we have a group of about 44 banks convened by our program and UNEP-FI. And we have commercial institutions that create climate risk tools to help financial institutions assess the climate risks and opportunities that they're facing. And you could really do deep dives into the typical problems, the typical challenges, the emissions and alignment in your portfolios, for example, and assessing the diverse range of tools. So we have this dashboard that you can see on the right, in addition to the climate risk report. So you can see all of the different offerings that these organizations have created, what sorts of scenarios that they're looking at, and the deep dives that they're able to do, the different functionalities, and the offerings that they have for financial institutions in particular. So I would definitely recommend looking through this report and also this dashboard if you're pursuing this journey to measure your climate risks and opportunities.
Great, thanks, Drew. And for those who haven't seen that report, it's really a great repository of all the tools that you might need. Many of you were asking about tools to be able to assess risks and also to determine which scenarios to make use of. So that's a really good starting point specifically for the banking sector. I'm just going to go back to this slide here about a few additional resources we have as well. So for today's session, we wanted to provide a few resources for banks, particularly looking at governance and strategy. So a few that might be helpful here is from the Brazilian Federation of Banks, which has here implementing the TCFD recommendations, a guideline. We also have from the Bank of Canada, assessing climate-related financial risks and a guide to implement these methods. From the European Central Bank, we have a guide on climate-related and environmental risks. And finally, from the private sector, we have HSBC, the Road to a Low Carbon Transition, their latest scenario analysis report, which you can use as an example. Now, along with that example, that last one there, you can go to the TCFD Knowledge Hub in order to access a number of other examples to see how your peers are doing this already. Great. And with that, we do have a time to address a few questions. I have a couple questions that have logged in our Q&A, so I will address those ones. And before I do that, I just want to let everyone know about the certificate for those of you that might have to jump off the call. So in order to get your certificate for this training today, we just require you to fill out a short feedback survey. And just to note that you will get 2 CPD credits for this session. And then tomorrow, if you come back and you fill out that feedback survey, you'll get the other 2 CPD credits for the second half of this training. So we do require you to fill that feedback survey in twice, one for each part of the training. This is a Google form, so some companies do have trouble accessing it. If they're doing it at their work location, we recommend maybe opening it on your mobile device instead. So you will get that link shared with you in the chat box. It'll also be sent to you via Zoom in 1 day's time, in tomorrow. So do check your junk mail if you wanted to access that. So with that, I'm gonna then, just because we have a few minutes left with you, address a few of the questions that we have in the Q&A. So one of them that Daniela asked was that she has doubts about the companies that are considered as supporters in the TCFD page. And she asked, does this mean that these companies are reporting with TCFD recommendations? Now, it does not necessarily mean they are using the TCFD, but rather that they're supporting the TCFD. So you can all publicly support the TCFD by filling out an online form. Now, it's important to note that the TCFD does not assess any reports or evaluate the quality of any reports. As you might remember at the beginning, we were discussing that the TCFD did not intend to create kind of additional reports. So if a company decides that they want to create a TCFD report or a standalone climate report, that's because they've identified that they have a particular stakeholder group that is particularly interested in their climate-related risk management. So that's not the intention of the TCFD, though. The TCFD wants you to include this information together with your financial statements as context to those numbers, and to help us understand how you're mitigating those risks and capitalizing on those opportunities. So Daniela, it does not indicate any sort of quality of those reports, but it does indicate a company's first step. So often companies will do that in their first stage to indicate to their stakeholder groups that they are assessing this and that they're going to use the TCFD's recommendations in order to integrate climate into their strategy and risk management. We also were asking if there's going to be they said, ¿existe alguna conferencia para los meses próximos de la importancia de TCFD para alta dirección? So somebody's asking us here if there's going to be some sort of event or conference in the coming months related to TCFD for governance and the higher leadership. Now, TCFD, as you might have seen, is transitioning into the ISSB. So the ISSB launched just last week a climate guidance, and it's called their S2. And this guidance builds directly off of the TCFD. So what you'll probably be seeing more and more now is a discussion on the ISSB climate guidance, which pulls in the TCFD. So what you will be wanting to look out for then, Magdalena, is where you can find more information and conferences regarding ISSB. And we are going to be providing training on that. So coming in about October and November, please, you can feel free to join our newsletter and to get information of future training. Communicate with your stock exchange, let them know you're interested in training on ISSB. And that's where we can start to provide how things are changing and additional guidance on climate and disclosure. Okay, I'm just going to see, we have a few more questions coming up here. How our institutions can obtain support to implement a TCFD, any specialized consultants. So yeah, if you are looking for specialized consultants to help you move forward, I actually recommend starting with partners on our call today. And so please do check out UNEP-FI's TCFD for Banks website. And maybe either Hina or Drew can drop kind of some information in the chat box of what website they might want to look at. TCFD for Banks program at UNEP-FI does do training, education, and consultancy on this topic. Also, the IFC works very heavily in this area as well. So our teammates here from IFC can also help you as you move forward on your journey and to ensure that you're progressing in the right direction. I might move to the final slide here where you can see contact information. So if you would like additional support and consultancy services on this topic, please feel free to reach out to our partners at IFC and Unipify and also at CDP regarding their services as well. Okay, the final questions there are really regarding training and education. So I think that kind of covered that with that last question. And with that, I think I will bring our training here to an end. So before we close today, I do want to thank everybody for joining us and thank our partners at IFC, at Unipify, and CDP. Please do take a moment to do that homework exercise and to think about those different scenarios and how you might integrate them into your organization, and then come with your questions tomorrow so we can continue on that learning journey. As a reminder, tomorrow we're going to dive into the next 2 pillars. So today it was governance and strategy. Tomorrow we're going to look at risk management and metrics and targets. Really happy to see you all today. Thank you so much to our interpreters. I hope they were able to catch everything we were discussing, and we look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.